A quick note here. This podcast is called Metabolic Syndrome in Horses Part 1 because after I got done and started thinking about it, I know I need to be bringing you a Part 2, which is going to come out next week. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Horses Advocate Podcast. This is Doc T, Geoff Tucker, DVM. Just going to rehash something because this is the most commonly asked question. And I'm kind of taking all the questions and reformatting it under the title of What is Metabolic Syndrome in Horses? I was at a farm yesterday and the owner, the client, said, I still get a little confused about sugar, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and some of the other things I talk about on this podcast. So I thought I would just take a moment. And I think I've done this before, and I'll probably do it many times in the future, because this is so fundamental in what we're trying to get across to every horse owner out there, that your horse has a chance of becoming metabolically unfit if we don't stay on top of this. So let's start with, it's always like a merry-go-round. You know, where do you jump on the merry-go-round? It keeps going around, and it doesn't matter where you jump on. You can, once you get on, you can move about the whole carousel, even though it's moving. So let's jump in and just look at some of the fundamentals. One being, what is food? And while this sounds like a really stupid question, it's essential to understanding life. It's just at the basis of everything that we do. Food is what all living things on the planet require because of one simple fact. Whether you're a plant or an animal, there is a rule of the universe that states everything needs to come back to its original state, and that's called entropy. Entropy is total chaos, and total chaos is basically no organization. So if you just close your eyes, or keep them open if you're driving, please, and understand that the order that you see out there, whether it's the asphalt in front of you or the shavings or the stall walls or the horse, the dog, your loved ones, the trees, the flowers in your potted plant, the pot itself, everything, the sky, the clouds, everything is some way removed from total chaos into some sort of organized structure that you and I can see, we can understand, we can hear it, we can feel it, touch it, smell it. Our senses can get a hold of it. Even in outer space, where it looks like there's nothing, there are still things like gamma rays. There are particle waves that Einstein discovered and they finally proved totally exist. So we're a big earth ball floating up and down in the waves, moving closer to the sun and moving further away. Hence, we're getting hotter or we're having an ice age. There are so many things out there that are occurring that try to organize complete chaos. And complete chaos is true nothingness. It's just energy, and it might even be less than that. But that energy has to be organized into atoms, and those atoms have to be organized into molecules, and those molecules are what we see. For instance, if you take a gas that you can't see called oxygen, another gas that you can't see called hydrogen, and you mix those two together into H2O, you're going to see either ice or water or vapor, depending on the temperature. I know this is basic chemistry, and I think everybody out there, no matter what your grade level is, understands that when you turn the faucet on or pump the handle in your water pump outside, you're going to get something liquid that you intrinsically know you have to drink to stay alive. And that is water. Pardon me. Still don't have a cough button. Good grief. I don't even know where to get one. Oh, well, sorry about that. Anyway, so we have water, and we all realize we need water, and we all realize that we need air. So those two things we can knock off the list in this discussion, because we know we need air and water, and those are coming into our bodies and our horses' bodies and are being mixed with the foods that we stick in our mouths. Now, it's really interesting because you think you have a very unique DNA, but it turns out that literally, and I'm not joking here, 99.9% of the DNA that you have, you share with your horse and your dog and a lot of other animals out there. This is why when you look at the hen running around outside, or you see your kitten purring in your lap, you're going to notice that there's 2 ears, 2 eyes, a nose with 2 nostrils, a mouth, usually with teeth, and a tube running from the mouth to the other end where poop comes out. And inside, there are different organs that we know about that we share. I mean, your horse and you have a liver. The one thing a horse doesn't have is a gallbladder. But basically, 99.9% of the DNA in our genetic makeup are shared with your horse. So with that, we also know that there are a couple of functions that we share. And that is at a cell level, meaning that we are made up of cells. There are certain reactions going on in that cell, and sometimes specifically within what's called an organelle, which is like a part of inside the cell, that we're going to call the mitochondria, which a lot of people remember as the mighty mitochondria, or the furnace, or where energy is created. Now, what happens in this mitochondria is not only are the atoms from water and air mixed, but the atoms of food. And these atoms are put together somewhere by nature into things called fats, sugars, and proteins. And those fats, sugars, and proteins and minerals are shoved in the mouth, sometimes involuntarily, sometimes with a glutton, like I often get toward dinner time. And these foods come in there and mix and are sent and transported to the cell. And in the cell, we mix everything together in the mitochondria, and it functions flawlessly to create energy. And that energy is called ATP, and it's moving from ATP to a different state called ADP, which is from T for try, D for die, which is 2, and then AMP. M stands for mono, and mono means 1. So it goes from 3 to 2 to 1 of phosphoruses. That's the P in adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And that, when it breaks off, it gives off an electron or some sort of energy. And that energy is put into the system, if you will, a battery. And from the battery, those electrons are released and used for purposes that are too numerous to say here, but just say it organizes everything. It creates cells, it repairs cells, it grows hair, it grows hoof. It keeps us moving, breathing. It keeps us alive. And when any of these things stop coming in, whether it's food in the form of proteins, fats, or sugars, or if it's air, meaning specifically oxygen, if those are not allowed to come into the body, then the body stops working, and it's called death. And death can come from in age. We just no longer function properly. We run out of working processes that are in effect viable enough to keep us alive. And it could be just we wear out. It could be a disease that comes in there, whether it's COVID or cancer. It could be a bullet that basically takes our blood out of our body so oxygen isn't transported. So we die of lack of oxygen. So, and of course, if we go into water too long, again, there's no oxygen that comes into us mammals. So it's basically simply this. You have entropy, which is the continuous force that drives everything that we know or even imagine into a state of nothingness. And every moment, and I don't mean every second, I mean every moment between 1 and 2 seconds, every moment your body is working hard to create the energy it needs, so is your horse, by the way, to keep the form that you see in front of you, the horse, to keep that form as is. And if any of those things don't get in there, entropy will take over, and eventually what you see in front of you will turn into dust and blow away. And that dust, in fact, will become nothingness. Now, what does that have to do with equine metabolic syndrome? Well, as I said, if you start to alter the processes in what we call dis-ease versus ease, in dis-ease, we change the function that's going on that helps us stay alive. So how can we do that in what's called metabolic syndrome? And it was really funny because I just learned this. It used to be called Syndrome X. And I think that was in the 1900s someplace. I can't remember exactly when they said it, but it wasn't too far long ago. I think they called it in the 80s Syndrome X. I just don't remember. They knew about metabolism, but they didn't understand what metabolic syndrome was. It's fascinating because there are certain identifying traits in humans that we use. One of the most obvious identifying trait is your waist, your circumference. And I forgot what the rule is. I shouldn't put it out here unless I have my notes in front of me, but I just don't have them. But I think a waist size of 40 in a man or above is one of the major criterias for you having metabolic syndrome. High blood pressure, certain blood values, your HDL, which is a high density lipoprotein, if that's too high. I know we all look at LDL, low density lipoprotein, but I've been trying to tell people it's bigger than that. Don't just look at your LDL or what they used to call the bad cholesterol, but those physicians who understand it are now getting away from that. Thank you again, the news media who dubbed it bad cholesterol, because it's not bad at all. In fact, it's required for life. So it's a long story, but I cover that other places. But we don't measure cholesterol in horses, and we don't measure our triglycerides in horses, although we can. And we do measure blood glucose, and we measure insulin. And these are blood values that many of you know about, because your veterinarian comes in and draws blood and tells you what your blood glucose or your horse's blood glucose is. What's fascinating is it all depends on when the blood is taken. Like if you feed your horse and then the vet comes in and draws blood, you're going to have high insulin, you're going to have high blood glucose. It's just the way it is. But it shouldn't be too high. It's when the values really skyrocket that something's going on. So let's just look at these two things. First of all, it's very, very, very interesting to know that in humans, I don't know about horses, but in humans, at any one moment in a normal, healthy person, there's about 5 grams of sugar floating around in your blood that's not attached to insulin. It's free blood glucose. And that means if I took all your blood out of you right now, if you're assuming that you're healthy and you're not diabetic, and put it in a centrifuge and spun everything out and was able to separate out all the sugar from everything else, there'd be 5 grams. Now, remember, there's 454 grams to a pound. So 5 grams is very, very light. And if you want to put it in a measure that's simple in your kitchen, it would be about 1 teaspoon of sugar. 1 teaspoon. How many tablespoons of sugar are in that Coca-Cola you're drinking. Sorry, Coke. Let's pick on Pepsi or Mountain Dew or any of these sugar-laden drinks, including Gatorade. How much sugar are in these drinks? And 1 teaspoon is what's supposed to be circulating. Beyond that, insulin has to come in and grab it. Why? Because free roaming glucose in your blood vessels is bad. It leads to damage to the arteries, and it leads to atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. This is the #1 killer of humans on the planet. That's just, I mean, I don't know if I should include car wrecks or, anything else, but it leads cancer and it leads all other diseases. But cancer and cognitive function decline and cardiovascular diseases are the 3 leading causes of death in humans. And in horses, I would say the leading causes of death would be that are non-traumatic are laminitis and colic. And I don't really know which 2 are in the lead there. But how many horses do we have that we've had or that we know of other people who have died of colic or laminitis? I mean, we have breakdown, loss of use, and that's a whole different subject. We have horses getting kicked, broken bones. We're not talking about that. We're talking about metabolic diseases. And yes, on occasion, you have a horse that does have cancer or liver disease, but I'm struggling right now. There are some genetic diseases out there, whether they're tying up EPSM. Let's see, what else? Horses are pretty good. Why are they pretty good? Because they only eat vegetables, and that's the way they were created. You and I were created to eat meat, and if you have chosen to become a vegetarian, that is a conscious decision, but didn't take into account our evolution. And people who do become vegetarians, it requires an extreme effort to get all the proteins you need in our designed digestive system. But the horse's digestive system is designed to eat nothing but plants off the ground. In other words, not trees, not bark, not wood, but basically plants off the ground, which differs them from ruminants such as cattle, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, antelope, buffalo, all those guys. It only boils down to all equids, including asses and zebras. It includes the tapir in South America. It includes the rhinoceros, yes, the rhino, which is very similar in digestive tract to the horse. So they're very limited in what they're supposed to eat, and it's mostly plants. So they don't get a large range of diseases like humans do, because humans have decided to add all sorts of things. And I know if you've been paying attention to human diets, they say don't eat anything that you can't read the ingredients in, or that have more than, I think some people say 3 ingredients, some people say 5 ingredients. But, if you look at a cookie wrapper and you'll see that there's way more than 5 ingredients in a cookie that you buy, even at a boutique coffee shop, they have things for sale that shouldn't be sold because they have preservatives and all sorts of things in there. But in horses, we're pretty lucky. They usually eat just grass, and that's great. But when you start looking at the food labels, they have 20 different ingredients packed into this thing, and we are buying them up because we think having all these ingredients are good. And yet we're also being told that if you eat anything with all these ingredients in it as a human, it's bad. So there's a paradox going on there. If you're feeding your horses something that has more than 1 or 2 ingredients on the list, let's just say if there's 3 or more ingredients in it, hold on. There's a product out there that has shredded coconut, it has rice bran, it has flaxseed. Well, there's 3 ingredients, 2 of which I think are inflammatory. So should the horse be eating it? And if you take anything out of your feed room and you look at it and there's more than 1 or 2 ingredients, be careful. If it says oats, okay. If you have to feed grain, oats seems great. But otherwise it's hay. And you could say, well, there's a blend of hays in there. There's, a legume like alfalfa, and there's a grass like Timothy, and there might even be some weeds in there. Well, that's a variety of the same thing, and that's different than adding ingredients such as preservatives to your hay. And everybody's buying hay has noticed that there's no longer, very rare that we get a bale of hay with dust in it, and that's because it's been preserved during the growing process. And there are hays out there, such as alfalfa, that you can go out right today if you're a farmer and buy Roundup Ready alfalfa, which means you can throw the seed on the ground and watch it grow and then spray it with the herbicide, glyphosate, and it'll kill all the weeds and allow the plant to grow uninhibited by fighting for nutrition with the weeds. So you have a better, denser crop. And most of us are feeding Roundup Ready alfalfa or some sort of preservatives put on our hay so it doesn't have dust and mold. So we're feeding, and I guess if you really want to get really down to it, you're going to be feeding organic, and nobody can afford organic. I know I can't. You have to. It would be much better if we all had 100 acres for our 2 or 3 horses and turned them out. We knew everything that was going on that paddock. But there's the other rub. Nobody can afford 100 acres for 2 or 3 horses. They can afford 10 acres for 10 horses, maybe. Or if you're down here in South Florida, you have maybe 2.5 acres and you put your 2 or 3 horses on it. And that's it. That's what you got. And it's usually just one grass out there. Maybe you're smart. You've got 2 or 3 grasses, but it's not the smorgasbord, the wide variety that a horse would get if it was migrating like it used to. That's the other key thing about these ground plant eating animals. They would migrate from the south in the winter to the north in the summer, and they would get every type of plant that was available, and they'd have this variety. And those of you who have been, keeping your ear to the ground about human nutrition, there is a whole group of people who believe that humans should be eating a wide variety of plants that are seasonally available, and that is what keeps your microbiome or the gut health really in peak condition. And most of us, we just visit McDonald's every day. Or we eat the same food every night, and we're not getting that biodiversity in our gut. Now, I know I've really kind of gotten off the question about metabolic syndrome, so let me reel myself back in. I've thrown a lot of information at you, and this is why it's so difficult to talk about metabolic syndrome, because there's all these offshoots that if we wanted to follow them down, it would really confuse the issue. And I'm trying not to confuse the issue, but there just seems so many paths to go on. So let me just reel it back a little bit and say, we've got a horse that is eating and putting in its body air and water, and we're not going to discuss them. Other than that, there's minerals, fats, sugars, and proteins. And the minerals are important. Remember, minerals are anything but carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So it's the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, copper, selenium. All these things are minerals. And the minerals, we have to remember, are highly regulated. So if the horse doesn't need it, it's not going to absorb it through the gut through a chelation system. But if you absolutely don't have these minerals in the ground, then they're going to get a deficiency. But I keep telling people that if you're pumping water out of the ground, and most horse owners do, they don't feed city water, but they're feeding groundwater through a well pump system, they're going to get a ton of minerals through there. And if they're feeding vegetation such as hay, that hay has probably been fertilized with minerals to make sure that the plant crop is as healthy as can be. That's what farmers do. They want a healthy crop because the healthier it is, the more dollars they can make. So they're going to be applying these fertilizers that are basically minerals to keep the plant healthy. So your horse is going to be getting a bunch of minerals there. But there's a fear system out there in marketing world that says, are you sure your animal, your horse is getting all the minerals it needs? Well, why don't you get these minerals? And if you're throwing these minerals in, that's fine. I just looked at a mineral package that has also added wheat middlings. Well, the wheat middlings are inflammatory. So now you have an inflamed gut. And how good is it at absorbing these minerals if it's inflamed? It also has all these vitamins. Well, who made the vitamins? How long have they been sitting on the shipping dock? I keep saying, if you feed vitamins that are made by nature, you know what you're getting. But if you're getting vitamins, and believe it or not, as far as I know, most of the vitamins that humans take and other herbs are actually manufactured in China. That's a huge industry for them. And they are shipping them out because it's cheaper to make them there and to import them. So we have a lot of, vitamins that are made in another country. And I think vitamin E, I remember, sometimes I have to dip into this memory bank that may not be perfect, but I think vitamin E was made in Scotland and China. Those are the only two places that make it. And that's it. So not made in America, which I find fascinating. Everybody's running out to get vitamin E for their horse. And like, do you even know who made it? How long it's been in the shipping dock? Is what's in the bag actually what's on the label? And have you run a guaranteed independent analysis of what's in that bag? Just because your horse likes it doesn't mean that the nutrients are in there. It could just be that it's a sugar treat. So I'm very skeptical of all nutrients unless they run specific independent tests that prove that what's in that capsule, that scoop, that whatever is exactly what they say it is. And then they add chelation materials, ligands, they're called, to the minerals to help absorb it. But I ask people, how do you know it's making it through the acid bath? How do you know that this mineral is actually being absorbed? And then a lot of people are looking at hair analysis to find out what their mineral deficiencies are. And that's great, but it may not be that you've got a mineral deficiency. One of the biggest, largest group of ligands, these molecules that bind to minerals that allow them to be absorbed, are amino acids. And if you're chronically protein deficient in your horse and you're not feeding a high quality protein in your diet, how on earth is a horse supposed to bind to these minerals and get them absorbed? So is the deficiency because you're not feeding enough copper, zinc, iron, selenium, whatever? Or is it because you're not feeding enough protein that's not allowing the horse to absorb these things? So here you are throwing in all these chelated minerals, which is trying to bypass this regulatory system. And, where's the proof? I've yet to see the actual proof. There's correlations out there in underpowered and underfunded studies that are correlating mineral to a deficiency, but they're not looking at the causation, and we don't have that yet. So, everybody wants you to trust the science, but when the science is so bad, if you've been listening to my podcast, you know that I really, really, really don't like science that's being presented for the horse world because it is suspect at best. So again, I've gone down a rabbit hole and we're trying to talk about metabolic syndrome. And if you're still with me, I appreciate that. We're into this about 30 minutes and I'm still touching on this thing called metabolic syndrome. So let me get back to it. I just want to rule out air, water, and minerals. And now we're going to be looking at fat, sugar, and protein. Now, these three items can be used for, let's look at it this way. Protein can be used as an energy source. And it's also used in so many other processes in our bodies to make these things work, called enzymes. They are used in neurotransmitters so we can think and move our arms and our eyelids. So proteins are so important. They're part of our immune system. They're part of the connective tissue that keeps everything together, not just the muscles. They're part of our integument, meaning the structure of hair and hooves. So proteins are everywhere. They are used either alone or in combination, like with fats, kind of like lipoproteins. And here we go back to HDL, high density lipoproteins, HD, high density L lipoprotein. And that is a molecule made of proteins and fats put together so they can carry particles in them, such as triglycerides or cholesterol. So it's like a shipping container. So when they're measuring your shipping containers, you need to know what's inside the shipping containers. And there I go down another rabbit hole. Sorry about that. Let's just stay focused. So proteins are essential in every walk of life. If you look at fat, fat is can be used as a fuel, and it can be used to store energy, such as body fat. It can be used to make cell walls. All cells in our body are made up of walls that are made of fat. Fat is used in hormones. It's used in the lipoproteins. There's a lot of uses for fat, and we enjoy that. Fat's critical. The whole craze that started after somewhere in the 1960s of our government saying you should have a low-fat diet was totally wrong. I mean, if it's like starving you, if you aren't eating fat, you're not getting the whole band of nutrients that you should be having. So fat's an essential nutrient. Some of them are called essential fatty acids that you can't get by manufacturing. So you have to eat these fats. Fats come in three different flavors: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And all the polyunsaturated, which we'll call PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA, all PUFAs are pretty much inflammatory. They can bind to things in your gut, dead bacteria, basically, and they can walk through the gut wall, just they can leak through it. And they found them in joints of humans. And when they remove the polyunsaturated fatty acids, joint pain goes away. And I've seen it in horses where the polyunsaturated fatty acids are removed and the horses are, running around the field, not stiff anymore. So just as a rule of thumb, all seed oils are PUFAs. So if your oil is from corn, vegetables, seeds, whether it's sunflower seeds or flax seeds or soybean oil, any of these oils are probably inflammatory, but they're used in every food out there because that's how the mixing machines stay lubricated, so they can mix this stuff, this massive ingredients that's on your list, and then run it through their machine that either pelletizes it or puts it into these chunks, or however it's presented to you in the bag. So that's what the seed oils are for, because they're dirt cheap. If you want monounsaturated fats, you stick with oils from fruits, which includes coconut oil, avocado oil, and of course, olive oil. And nobody feeds these oils to horses. And why don't they feed oils to horses? And believe me, if you put coconut oil and soybean oil together, you're making, in my opinion, a mess. You're adding all these polyunsaturated oils. But the horse is going to make all their fats from cellulose, which is why they're out there eating all the time, eating what's called the structural carbohydrates. And the gut bacteria are going to turn them into short-chain fatty acids. So when they're out there grazing on what you think is a dormant winter pasture, where the horse really is kind of picking and doesn't really want to eat a lot, the reason he doesn't is because the sugar content's low, and he's basically eating butter. And I know it doesn't look like or taste like butter, but the bacteria in his hindgut is going to take all that cellulose and it's going to break it down into butyrate, butyric acid, which is what butter is, also pyruvate and acetate. And those fatty acids power the horse through the winter. So, as long as he or she can have access to the structural carbohydrates or cellulose, they can make it through the winter. And that's the purpose of making hay. Remember, hay is last summer's grass. So they take a grass growing in June and they cut it when it's high in sugar and also in structural content, because the grass is growing. So when it grows, it's making cellulose. So it's a blend of sugar and fat. And the horse is going to eat that in the dead of winter when there's snow covering the ground. That's the purpose of hay. And they're going to get a sugar load and a fat load, which is great. And this is going to bring me back to what metabolic syndrome is. But people who feed hay 24/7 when there's plenty of pasture out there, you're wasting money. But on the other hand, nobody has enough pasture for their horse. So they only put them on pasture. The pasture becomes a dirt lot, or they start to lose body fat, because that's what horses do. They'll dive into their body fat to stay alive. So you're feeding them hay because you have to, and that's where they're getting the sugar from. Okay. Now you know about proteins and how important they are. You know about fat and where a horse gets it from. And then you now know where sugar comes from. It comes from starch. And starch is how plants store their sugar for future use. So you and I store our sugar as glycogen, and we put it in our muscles and our liver. So if the predator comes around the corner and we have to run and escape, we can dive right into the glycogen and use sugar. And that's going to be fantastic. So just to recap, we're put 6 things in our mouths. You can argue 7: air, water, minerals, fat, sugar, and proteins. And if you want to throw in another one, you have phytonutrients, which is a whole other subject that nobody knows anything about. We're all guessing. But the proteins are used for everything that make us work. It keeps entropy at bay. The fat comes in, and there's structural things that we use with fat, but we also use it to store energy for future use. And glucose, which is sugar in the form of starch, comes into the horse's body, and it's either stored for future use as glycogen in the muscles or in the liver, or it is used right away. And right away means it usually goes to the brain, because the brain uses about 20 to 25% of all sugar that's in our bodies, and we're going to assume also in a horse's body. So 20 to 25% of everything that you eat as sugar is used by the brain. That's just a hog, because the brain only weighs about 2% of our body weight, 4 pounds for a 200-pound man. So the rest of the sugar has to be sequestered, kept away from free floating in our body. It has to either be stored as glycogen for future use, immediate future use. And like what I say is, when guests pop over, unannounced, and you open the door and you're surprised, and oh my gosh, somebody's here to visit, you don't call up Amazon and say, send me some food. You go to your pantry and open the cabinets and you look for something that you can feed them. And that's what glycogen is. It's immediate use, stored in your pantry, in the cell's pantry, for immediate use. But what happens is, when glucose comes into the mouth and is absorbed through the gut wall, it is immediately assigned to a host, a chaperone. Let's call it a chaperone. And that's called insulin. And of course, insulin is a hormone, and it is a protein. So proteins are important to make insulin. Now, we have insulin production in the pancreas that is produced at the same level as the body's recognizing its increasing sugar content. So the more sugar you eat, the more your pancreas is going to create insulin. And this is why, if you're eating a lot of sugar and your doctor takes your blood sugar and it looks high, that's a real warning sign that you're producing more insulin than you should, than a normal person. And the same thing with your horse. If your horse is producing more insulin than it needs normally for a healthy horse, that is an indicator that your horse is taking in too much sugar. And the simplest way is not through drugs like metformin, but to decrease the amount of sugar your horse is getting to eat. And that comes from stop feeding hay or limit the pasture or soak the hay and get all the free sugars out of there, or a combination of all of these things. And certainly don't be feeding grain, which is loaded in starch and sugar. So even if it says low starch, and that's one of my pet peeves, if I put 3 plates in front of you, and on one plate you have a whole donut, the second plate you have half a donut, third plate you have no donut, which of the 3 plates has the lowest carbs? Well, obviously it's a plate with no donut on it. But what gets me is, here marketing's coming in and make us look like fools. Because if you look at the half a donut, well, why don't you just feed the whole oats, but just half of them? That's cutting the calories in half. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But no, you go out and you buy this low-carb feed that is, they've reduced the amount of grains in them, and they've put fillers in so you can put that scoop in and you're still getting a hefty amount because that makes us feel better. And you dump it in, and most of the ingredients are inflammatory. They're waste products. They're the grain companies basically saying, what are we going to do with all this stuff, these hulls that we've taken off wheat so we can make white flour and white pasta, or out of rice, and we call it rice hulls. And so we can have white rice. And all these excess hulls, soybean meal. I love soybean meal, but to do it, we have to take the outer hulls off. So we have these hulls of soybeans, and they're throwing them back in the food, which are all inflammatory because of the proteins that are in the hulls called lectins that are causing inflammation in our horses. So it's a joke, as far as I'm concerned, that the feed companies are playing on us horse owners, saying, but these are valid ingredients, and they're not. So, if you want half the calories, just eat half as much. It's just a no-brainer. Everybody knows that if you only, if you cut the donut in half, you're eating half the calories. That's that simple. I try not to eat donuts personally, but same with the bagel. Have half a bagel. If you're having a hamburger, just eat the meat and throughout the bun. You're going to reduce the calories plus the inflammatory ingredients. But I digress. Let's talk about horses. Stop feeding grain. That's the best way to get your low calorie. But if you insist on feeding grain because your horse is old and it's lost a lot of body fat, then just go to whole ingredients, whole oats, whole corn, or you can get shredded coconut meal and feed that as a fat source. That's much better. But I would just be careful feeding excess glucose. The reason for that is simple. When glucose comes in to the body, insulin grabs it and escorts it as a chaperone through the blood to the muscle cells, because the muscle cells, other than the brain, is the leading consumer of glucose. Remember, 20 to 25% goes to the brain. We get it. But the muscles use a lot as well. So the glucose goes to the cell. Now, they can't send sugar through the cell wall because the cell wall is fat, and we know that oil and fat doesn't mix. So the hormone, insulin, has to knock at the door, and the cell answers by sending their butler called GLUT4. And that's how I want you to remember it. They send a butler, and the butler opens the door and creates a small tunnel. And the glucose falls down in the tunnel through the cell wall as a passive event. So it's an active event that creates an opportunity for glucose to pass through passively. And that's what happens. So if the cell gets too much glucose, it can't fill up the glycogen anymore. This is why having more muscle helps all animals, because the more muscle you have, the more glycogen storage you have, so the better chance you have a place to put the glucose. But if they can't put the glucose in the cabinets anymore, in the pantries, then you have to do something with it, and you throw it into the fireplace, the furnace, the mitochondria, and they churn it up and spit out some ATP. And the ATP creates this molecule of energy or spark of energy that's stored in the battery called the electron transport chain. But I'm adding these things to those who want to learn this. But if you don't want to learn it, you want to keep it simple, just know that insulin knocks at the door, presents some sugar. The butler comes to the door, opens it up. The sugar falls in, and it's put either into the pantry for future use, or it's immediately burned up. Know that the process of burning glucose is inefficient and creates something called free radicals, and you have to keep burning the glucose to get enough energy. In the meantime, remember, fat's being delivered to the cell too, because they eat cellulose and there's fat floating around in the lipoproteins, and they're being delivered to the cell too. And the cell starts to accumulate this fat called triglycerides. And again, the word tri means 3, triglycerides. And within the cell, they break off one of the fatty acids, so it becomes a diglyceride, or two fatty acids attached to this molecule. And now we have a diglyceride. Well, what's interesting is the diglyceride, you can call it DAG, D-A-G. That's because it's called diacetyl glyceride. But anyway, DAG. They signal a problem inside the cell, because when it starts to accumulate, you have actual intracellular fat. And that's not to be confused with extracellular fat, such as marbling of a steak that you're going to eat. But this is within the cell. And when that happens, and I like to tell people, DAG becomes jealous. It's sitting there next to the fireplace saying, why aren't you using me? Why are you ignoring me? Why do you keep going to the door and getting glucose in here? I'm pissed. And it goes to the butler, and it sabotages the butler. So GLUT4, the butler, can't go to the door and open it up anymore. So you have increasing intracellular fat that shuts down this process of building a tube and opening the door. So glucose comes to the door, and insulin knocks, says, I've got some more glucose for you, and the cell won't open the door. That is insulin resistance right there. No other way to describe it. It's basically the cell is saying, no, I don't want you in here anymore. This happens not just at the muscle cell, it happens at the liver, and it also happens at the brain, at the blood-brain barrier. And if it happens to the blood-brain barrier, the amount of glucose that's actually being allowed into the brain decreases. It's like having a fuel filter in your engine, your gas-powered car, your diesel-powered car, and you know how important it is to keep those fuel filters clean. But if it gets clogged up, then it doesn't get as much fuel, and your car starts to cough and sputter. Your pickup truck just doesn't have the power going up the hills. And this is what happens in all brain diseases, including anxiousness and depression. And this is why when horses are removed from excess grain, where they're getting zero sugar other than what's coming in from hay and pasture, their brain, within 4 days, you've got a completely different horse. You've got a horse that's more willing partner. It's not doing bad things like coming unglued inside a horse trailer, or trying to bite you, or stomping their feet as you're tightening the girth, or swishing their tail. This is one of the reasons they now are a willing partner for you. If you take them off all grain, there's your reason, because you're having not just inflammation in the gut from all these inflammatory ingredients, but you're also getting a decreased amount of glucose going into the brain, which leads to all sorts of behavioral issues in humans as well as horses. Another good reason to stop feeding grain. So let's just wrap this up. Glucose has to be used, and if it's not used in the muscle cells or the brain or the liver, and it can't be stored as glycogen, there's only one other place glucose can go, and that is through the liver. It's converted into body fat. So glucose and body fat have the same elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. It's just that glucose has it in a ring structure and fat has it in a long chain structure. So just think about that. Every time you eat your candy bar, it becomes body fat on you. Every time you eat sugar in excess, cookies and cakes, or if you're feeding your horse treats, all these sugary treats and hay and pasture and grain, and then you wonder why the horse is starting to get fat. I mean, it moves from a nice body covering, so it looks pleasing, but then all of a sudden you see a crusty neck or you see fat pads. And what's happening is all that sugar is being converted into body fat. And your horse has insulin resistance, basically. The horse is doing what it's supposed to. But if you measured the blood glucose, it would still be within that normal range because insulin is high. So they're eating all the sugar, insulin is being produced. Now, what happens is when the insulin can't produce enough insulin for whatever reason, and the blood glucose goes higher, then insulin levels go up. And at some point, too much occurs. And now we're into what's called type 2 diabetes. And in horses, this inflammation that's created by increased body fat, which releases cytokines, which are inflammatory ingredients, and you have increased insulin because you have to take care of the sugar. And when you can't take care of the sugar and your blood glucose starts to rise after every meal and it floats around your body for a little bit, I believe, this is just my personal opinion, that in humans, that excess blood glucose is leading to atherosclerosis, which is damaging the blood vessels, basically, which leads to stroke and heart attacks. But I believe that in humans, in horses, the number one place where it inflames is in the lamina of the horse's hooves, which leads to inflammation of the lamina called laminitis and leads to detachment of the hoof capsule from the coffin bone, and you start to get rotation. I believe that's where laminitis comes from, or if you want to call it founder, because I think it's pretty well established that every foundered horse, every horse with laminitis has insulin resistance. I just don't see it in starvation cases. If they're starved, they're not laminitic. It just doesn't happen. And also in horses that are healthy, that are usually young because they have the ability to absorb all this glucose and use it because they're running around, they don't get laminitis. It's when they become more sedentary or they're just being fed too much sugar. So the body the cells start to reject it because that's what they do with excess sugar and body fat. So they have insulin resistance, and that leads to damage to the blood vessels in the capillary system of the hoof, and that creates the inciting cause of laminitis. I will add that I believe that the reason why the hoof wall separates out is because the hoof hasn't been healthy. If there's one expression you want to remember for the rest of your life is feed the hoof. And every farrier and every veterinarian I talk to and ask them, why does it stink when you put the hot shoe on the bottom of the hoof? Not one in the past 12 months has been able to answer that question. But simply put, 25% of that hoof is one amino acid called cysteine. And cysteine is made from methionine that they have to eat. And methionine is limited in the real world. So you have to be adding it from an extra protein source, such as soybean meal. And that amino acid methionine that is converted by the horse into cysteine is the only amino acids that have sulfur in it, and sulfur creates these very strong double bonds that provides the integrity, the strength to the hoof. It makes a hoof wall strong. It prevents tearing away of the coffin bone because the attachments are stronger. It prevents cracks and sole abscesses. But whenever you see a hoof problem, it's incumbent to feed the hoof so you have something that you can work with. I mean, you need the skills of a farrier to help balance the hoof and make sure that it's, trimmed in a way that is effective for your sport. Whether you put a shoe on it or not, I don't want to get into. That's irrelevant. Because if you're putting a shoe on a crumbly hoof, a hoof that has not been fed well, you're not going to have a good result. And I think this is where everybody thinks horses should be left barefoot. But a barefoot horse that's not being fed well is also going to have problems. You have to feed the hoof. And you do that by providing a high quality protein source that has the methionine in it so the horse can convert it over into cysteine that makes up 24% of the hoof. But I want to wrap up this insulin resistance metabolic syndrome, which you now thoroughly understand that metabolic syndrome is basically what diseases occurs from not having the right metabolism. In humans, it includes cardiovascular disease, it includes cancer, and it includes cognitive decline. And in horses, I believe it leads to bad behavior. That's a blood-brain barrier inflammation and decreased glucose transport into the brain. It creates cardiovascular disease in the form of laminitis and possibly colic, especially from inflammation and a change in the gut microbiome because you're feeding it all sorts of garbage. And as far as cancer goes, for whatever reason, horses just don't get that much cancer, but you certainly see equine sarcoid, which is a bovine virus that gets in there. And why can't the horse take care of that? It's probably because of the immune system. And the immune system is almost all protein. So obviously, I mean, if you're listening to this, you're saying, well, I need to feed more protein because that's a high quality protein, because that seems to be why my horse has low protein in there. And you're saying to yourself, okay, if the horse isn't eating it, it's that I need to supplement, and that's fine. I get it. And this is why I'm a big fan of soybean meal, because it's a high quality protein. But the one missing thing, now that we're coming up on 1 hour, I just want to put in the one thing that is like kind of hard for people to understand, but it's essential to understand. As you feed more sugar and you start to get insulin resistance, and the brain doesn't get as much sugar as it needs to keep working, the brain will ask the liver to go into its resources of free amino acids. Remember, all proteins are made up of smaller molecules called amino acids. Those amino acids are then broken down into glucose. And it's simply, they remove the amine group, the ammonia, the nitrogen, and what's left is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And it converts it into glucose and it feeds the brain. And that's why horses are chronically protein deficient, not just because you're not feeding the high quality protein, but you're consuming the protein. Now, it's pretty obvious that when the farrier nips off the hoof, or you take clippers and clip off all the hair, there's a lot of protein that's being lost. That protein is never getting back into the horse. So it has to eat to replace that. And that's pretty obvious. But what you don't see, that's invisible to our eyes, is that they're also converting free amino acids that are wandering around trying to find a home in the form of a protein. And those amino acids are being converted into glucose. Now, in a normal, healthy human, 15% of all sugar production is from the breakdown of amino acids that are no longer being used. So this is how protein can become energy. The protein is broken down into glucose in a process called gluconeogenesis, the new production of glucose. And that's being used by the body to fuel itself. So if you're having trouble understanding this, I want you to imagine, or maybe you have seen, a starvation case. There's movies of starving people, you know, videos, documentaries where they look like walking skeletons. Well, what has happened? The bottom line is they went right into their fat stores, and fat stores are there for emergency situations such as an ice age or winter when there's no food, and your body switches over to using body fat to keep you going. And body fat burns a much cleaner and is more efficient at creating energy than glucose will ever be. So it switches over to that, and you start to consume all your body fat. I guarantee you, if you go on a water fast diet where you're not eating any calories, you will switch over to starting to use your body fat. This is where ketones are produced. Now, when all your body fat goes, how are you going to keep alive? Well, you're going to start breaking down the muscles. This is why you see the walking skeletons. The top line goes away. The meat between the ribs goes away. And everybody says, oh, I can see his ribs. But in reality, it's not that you're seeing the ribs. You're noticing the lack of muscle between the ribs now that the fat's removed. The abdominal muscles get weaker, so you start to get the hay belly. You have the hooves start to fall apart. The hair coat doesn't have that luster, that shine in the moonlight. You have itching going on because the horse can't mount a good immune response to the flies in the summer. It has weeping eyes. Just the list is long. The tendons break down. The suspensory ligaments break down. You have DSLD. You have a breakdown of connective tissue, so you start to get cheek tooth fractures because dentin is a connective tissue. So you have all these diseases. The spinous processes start to come together because the muscle's being lost. And so you have kissing spine. You have all these diseases coming along, laminitis, founder, all the hoof ailments, walls that are being splayed out, heels that are being crushed. You're getting navicular syndrome because the hoof can't support the horse. It's just like in humans. Metabolic syndrome will lead to the three major causes of death in people, which is atherosclerosis, cancer, and cognitive decline. Dementia for those people, but there's all sorts of different ones besides dementia. So you have laminitis, colic, kissing spine, breaking down tendons, loss of use, ill-behaved horses, all these things, all because of metabolic syndrome in horses, because you're feeding more sugar than the horse needs. And yes, in the summertime, let the horse fatten up. That's the purpose of summer and summer grasses. But as winter comes and the grasses go in their dormant stage, don't freak out that your horse is starting to, quote unquote, lose weight. Because I guarantee you, I can have you drop between 10 and 20 pounds overnight. All I have to do is remove your arm, right? Because I'm removing body fat and muscle and water and bone. So when you say your horse is losing weight, you have to ask yourself, what weight is it losing? And more times than not, because most of our horses are more than 6 years of age when we're starting to notice this, we see that they start to lose body fat. And because you decide to do the no-grain diet and start soaking the hay and reduce the sugar content, so the body now switches over to body fat. And the body fat, it burns more healthily, and the horse is happier. It seems to be calmer. It has all the energy it needs. But now your eyeballs are seeing the loss of muscle that's been going on for 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 years. And you start to freak out because you think somebody's going to come knocking at your door saying you're not feeding your horse. Well, you haven't been feeding your horse correctly for a decade, maybe. And so your horse has lost all of its muscle. And then you try to catch up by feeding this soybean meal. And unfortunately, it's a slow process to build the muscles back. It may take 6 months to a year or even longer if the horse is 25, 30 years old. It may never get its muscles back. But the point is you have to give the proteins in there to make the horse healthy, whether they get all the muscles back or not. And if you take 3 steps back and look at your horse in a different light and say, is the horse healthy, happy? That's the bottom line. Are there no more tendon problems? Is the behavior right? Is the digestion right? Does the hair coat look great? That's what you'd be looking for. Is the fly bite dermatitis going away? And that takes up to 2 years for high protein to do. But until you get metabolic syndrome under control, I don't care how much protein you're going to be feeding, it's going to be consumed because the brain is screaming, give me sugar. And the body's just going to say, well, here's some soybean meal. We're just going to convert that into sugar and skip everything in between. So I hope I've brought to you all the information that you need on metabolic syndrome and how important it is. And it's a little bit more complex. There's a lot of dials that need to be adjusted as a horse goes from season to season, or from stressful event to non-stressful event, or back and forth. And every horse is an individual, because you have to count on all the gut bacteria. As the gut bacteria start to normalize, then you have to adjust what you're feeding them. And same with humans. And then you throw on top of it the different DNA, epigenetics and all this other stuff. But you have to understand the basics of metabolic syndrome. That's what I tried to do with this podcast. Sorry, I went a little long. I was expecting this to be just a short one, but nope. So I'm just going to bow out of here. And please, if you have any questions, come to the Horse's Advocate, become a member, and ask your questions there. That's where I do all my responding. And come join us for every other Thursday rounds meeting, where you can bring your questions. Say, can you go over this one spot? Take some notes on this and bring it to the meetings, and we'll go over it. Okay. So that's equine metabolic syndrome. I hope I've helped. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Hey, everyone. Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.